All right. Well, last week, Paul focused on the origins of the gospel that he preached. It originated from God, and Jesus actually revealed it to Paul on his journey to Damascus. And he received his commission to be an apostle or an emissary from Jesus himself, not from the apostles in Jerusalem or from any human, as Paul would say. And Paul went to, as we said last week, went to great lengths to prove this. This week, we're going to talk about Paul being accepted by the other apostles. And we will be covering, starting in chapter 2, we will be going down to verse 10 tonight. So Galatians chapter 2, 1 through 10. Then after 14 years I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus is in Greek. I took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation, and meeting privately with those esteemed as leaders, I presented to them the gospel that I preached among the Gentiles. I wanted to be sure I was not running or had not been running my race in vain. Yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. The matter arose because of some false believers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on our freedom we have in Christ Jesus to make us slaves. We did not give in to them for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. As for those who were held in high esteem, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not show favoritism. They added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they recognized that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. For God, who was at work in Peter as an apostle to the circumcised, was also at work in me as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Cephas, and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. All they asked, was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing that I had been eager to do all along. So let's start here with verse 1. After 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas, and I took Titus along also. Y'all remember last week Paul used this little word that I talked about, epetai, as a thing has happened in series. This is the last time he's going to use it in this series of events. So he is wrapping this up the last time. This is his last visit to Jerusalem before he actually writes this letter to the Galatians. And if y'all remember back in week 1, he wrote this letter on the eve of actually going back to Jerusalem, to the Great Jerusalem Council, where the apostles actually wrote the letter, you do not have to observe the Jewish law. So this Antioch ordeal that we will get to next week was a great part of that. So this time, though, I'm sorry.
I need to ask you something. So it said then after 14 years, so everything that went on when he first visited, was it still going on 14 years later? Or how did that?
No. This is what was going on in Galatia, and what was going on in Antioch is a recent event.
Okay.
So he had been off during that 14 years. He was still doing evangelistic work, and part of that 14 years he was evangelizing the Galatian territory. And no, what he's writing about here actually is more of a recent event. And he's writing in response to that. And then and the way it works in Acts is he's writing this letter, and then he and Barnabas are going to go down to the Jerusalem council. They appointed to go down to clear this matter up. But no, it wasn't going on for 14 years. We would have had more letters than this, I think, if that was the case. Like I said, it's 14 years later from the time that he went down or went up to Jerusalem. It was always up back then because he was going up into the mountains. When he got acquainted with Peter. So this is 14 years later. And he goes with Barnabas, or Barnabas in Greek. I like to let y'all know what these things sound like in Greek. Who was also associated with the apostles in Jerusalem. Barnabas, his real name was actually Joseph. And he was a Levite from Cyprus. It is the apostles who call him Barnabas. They basically gave him this nickname, which means son of encouragement. You can catch that in Acts chapter 4, 36 and 37. Barnabas is also the one who brought Paul to meet the apostles in Acts 9, 26 through 30. We talked about that last week. Paul didn't mention that Barnabas was part of that trip, but according to Luke, it was indeed Barnabas who actually introduced Paul to the apostles. And we learned last week that it was actually only two. It was Peter and it was James, Jesus' brother. Paul also decides to take, and I've already let the cat out of the bag, he let Titus go. That's the way it sounds in Greek, but we pronounce it Titus. But Titus is how it sounds. And this is also not mentioned in the Acts account. In Acts 11:30, when they went down during this time, there was a famine going on, by the way, at that time, and it's always considered the famine campaign. When this probably happened, this 14 years later, this meeting, and it was during the festival of unleavened bread when they went down. We don't necessarily we don't know exactly why, I guess, that they were going down, other than we're going to find out that it was some type of a revelation, but they was trying to do some famine relief down there. But in Acts, this whole visit is completely overshadowed with, this is at the point where in Acts 2 that Peter is thrown into prison and Herod dies and the angel comes and gets him out of prison. So the whole account when Paul and Barnabas and Titus were down in Jerusalem is kind of overshadowed by that story in Acts. But Paul was in Jerusalem at the time. Kind of gives you a feel for just how compressed Acts is and just how picky the stories are. You know, Paul and Barnabas and Titus were down there discussing the gospel that they preached, and but the writer of Acts overshadows that with Peter got in prison, angel came and got him out. That's just the nature of Acts. When you're trying to compress a history, it's very difficult to get everything. But that was what was going on. So as a result, Paul and Barnabas are just basically an afterthought in the account in Acts in chapter 12. Of course, on the other side of this, Paul doesn't make any mention of his second visit to Jerusalem as being part of the famine relief campaign that Luke talks about in Acts. So it kind of works both ways. What's the most important thing to Luke when he's writing Acts? During this time, as there was a famine campaign, people came to help. Oh, and by the way, the big story was Peter got thrown into prison for preaching the gospel. And an angel came and got him out. So that's just the way that it is. And Paul's, most important thing for Paul here was we went up to Jerusalem to discuss directly with the apostles the gospel that we preached. So you can just kind of see the differences there. In verse 2, I went in response to a revelation And meeting privately with those esteemed as leaders, I presented to them the gospel that I preached among the Gentiles. I wanted to be sure I was not running or had not been running my race in vain. Of course, the first thing we have to ask is apocalypsis. What revelation? What revelation did Paul have that he would feel compelled to go to Jerusalem to begin with? Well, we have some possibilities. As we talked about, it means a revealing. So something was revealed to Paul, and he thought he was reacting to that, so he's going to Jerusalem. Well, if you read the Acts account in Acts 11, there was this fellow named Agabus, and he was a prophet from Jerusalem, and he prophesied that there was going to be a famine that was going to spread across the Roman Empire. So it's possible that was the revelation that was revealed, that he's involved in the famine relief campaign. So maybe that's it. And maybe that's why Paul initially went on his second journey to Jerusalem. Or another thing could be, if we look at the context of Paul's letter, immediately here what he's talking about, then we might can conclude that the revelation that Paul received may have been over this having to do the law instead of just relying on your faith in Jesus. Now we will touch on that a little bit more later.
It seems to me like that would be more likely.
Because he's got it in the immediate context.
The wording of it too, meeting privately with those leaders.
Yeah. Well,
and presenting to them the gospel that
he very well, and that seems to be to me as well that it could be something like that. And then there could have been something going on, and some of the folks are in Jerusalem might have been already against Paul. He might have been revealed this, and it might not even been a spiritual revealing. It might have just been told to him. And that's the other thing about it. We think of revelation as a spiritual thing, but it could have just been he was made known. It was made known to him. It was pulled back, and he got to see what was going on. We'll go a little bit more in that in verses 4 and 5. Of course, the purpose of this revelation was to show that Paul only went to Jerusalem by something that had been revealed to him. Was it by God? Probably by God. And not because he was compelled to go to Jerusalem by the leaders in Jerusalem. That's the whole purpose of the letter. He's saying, I went to... It kind of rules out that somebody might have told him something. He's trying to make out, I only went to Jerusalem because a revelation that God gave me that I had to go. And I think we'll find out maybe he's starting to explain what that revealing or revelation was. And it could have still been he just took advantage of the famine campaign and, well, we have to go anyway. Let me take advantage of that. Paul's revelation probably represents either a personal revelation that the Holy Spirit revealed to him, or a revelation that was revealed in an open setting. Now this is, we've experienced this in our own congregation. The latter would possibly be by the Holy Spirit's activity in the local congregation. He would have been in Antioch at the time, where a prophetic word might have gone forth for Paul to go to Jerusalem. It's quite possible that is the case. It is also possible that Barnabas and Titus were involved in that revelation. That might be why they went. Might have been something prophesied to both of them. We just don't know. We just had to kind of do some conjecturing. But looking at the context of the letter, perhaps the revelation was for Paul to test the leaders in Jerusalem by taking Titus, which is another slant on what the revelation could have been. And Titus was an uncircumcised Gentile Christian. So perhaps that was part of it. Take Titus up to Jerusalem and see what these apostles have to say about that.
Yeah.
And I'm going to add this, and I actually have it highlighted in mine because this is just my musings, okay? It is also possible that the revelation or unveiling came about due to Paul taking Titus to Jerusalem. Perhaps Titus, being presented to the leaders in Jerusalem, sowed the seeds that produced the agitators, before this letter was written. Therefore, the revelation was the revealing of some of those in Jerusalem, that some of those in Jerusalem, what their true nature was about the Jewish law. Therefore, the whole unveiling, if that is the case, then the whole unveiling would not have happened until sometime later, perhaps at Antioch at the Peter and Paul conflict. So, in other words, Paul gets the word, I have to go to Jerusalem. And I have to take Titus. But he may not know why until later. It could be that God is rooting out some of this false teaching that is originating out of that Jerusalem church. Now that's just my musings. Probably have thought too much into it. But it's quite possible that it was all by design to single out the folks who were doing this teaching. And by Paul doing one small thing, he and Barnabas taking an uncircumcised Christian Greek Gentile.
Yeah.
He was able to get to the root of it, the starting of it. It's possible. Paul lays out what he preaches privately. Kat adion, according to one's own, is how it is. According to one's own. And then we have these little phrases here, the ones who are regarded to be influential, or the ones who are in high esteem, or we're going to talk a little bit about that. Here there is a short version, and there's two more versions of it. In literal Greek it means the ones who seem, or the ones who think, or the ones who are thought of to be. Later on in verse 2, he will expand it, and the literal Greek is the ones who are thought to be something. Yeah. Now, it was a general idiomatic expression at the time, but it was used in a good way, and it was also used in a bad way. Now, I know that there are other times that Paul uses those of you who think you are something or really nothing. He's used that stuff before. So it is quite possible that he's being a little ugly here. But it's not necessarily what he probably thinks about the apostles in Jerusalem. He's probably playing to what now has been planted into the Galatians' head, what they think, what the agitators have told them about the ones in Jerusalem. Oh, they're the ones with the authority, not Paul.
Yeah.
So he's probably using the expression to acknowledge that they are influential in Jerusalem, but at the same time admonishing the Galatians for, this is what you think, not what actually is. So it very well could be that way.
And I forgot that he was writing to the Galatians because everything was going on in Jerusalem.
Yeah. Here, the leaders in Jerusalem, we're going to find out that James, Peter, and John. We'll find that out in verse 10. Like I said, is he using this sarcastically? He probably is, but not towards those leaders. He's probably using it sarcastically towards the Galatians. Paul was not concerned if what he was preaching was incorrect. And I know it might seem that way. But he's probably concerned with, okay, if I'm preaching something, for instance, a law-free gospel, and the folks from Jerusalem were preaching, oh, you have to, in order to complete your salvation, you have to start doing the Jewish law. Well, obviously there's about to be a train wreck. I mean, think about it. So he wants to ensure that all the work he's been doing is not going to come to a collision point. So that's what he means, is I just want to make sure that I am not running in vain or have run in vain, is how it is in the Greek. And he just wants to make sure. Now, he did go up by revelation. Something stirred in him or something to get him to go up. So it's time to go see. It is interesting, though, that it's 14 years after the last visit to Jerusalem. And he's been preaching law-free gospel all that time. So he's trying to avoid the train wreck. Verse 3, yet not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. It's almost a small digression here, and there'll be a major digression later. Paul probably asked this for the sake of the Galatians. This is probably somebody that they knew. They probably knew Titus. Since Paul names him in the letter, it's probably someone they know. They would have known that Titus was an uncircumcised Greek Christian. It's quite possible that he was with them when he was preaching to the Galatians. So they know him. And this would provide further evidence to the Galatians that the leaders in Jerusalem did not contradict Paul. Titus was not compelled to be circumcised at all. So this is just kind of a little digression and adding to the Galatians that, hey, this person, he wasn't compelled to be circumcised. You know him. You know he's a Greek Christian. You know he's not following after the Jewish law. Let's move on to we're going to do verses 4 and 5. This matter arose because some false believers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on our freedom we have in Christ Jesus and to make us slaves. We did not give in to them for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. Now, this is a major digression. What we just said had nothing to do really with what was going on in Jerusalem as much as Paul is trying to restate for the Galatians, even Titus. They didn't even make him be circumcised, and they don't even believe that. Now he's going to go into, probably out of his emotion, what has stirred all this whole thing up to begin with. This is a major digression. The main question is this. Were these false, the NIV has false believers, but in the Greek it's false brothers. Did this thing happen at that conference in Jerusalem? Did they try to bust in there and while Paul was meeting with the apostles? Probably not. Is this part of the Antioch campaign, when he and Peter went at each other? It's quite possible that could be what it is. He's talking about the folks that came into Antioch and stirred it up, which we will hear about next week. But Paul is probably letting out a little emotion here while he's writing or while he's dictating. I'm sure it makes him mad. And he thinks about this. He's having to defend himself and from these people who have just claiming things that he has not preached, things that they're claiming that he's done that he has not done. So it's quite possible he's just being a little emotional here. I'm thinking that it's dealing with the Antioch episode that we'll talk about next week, and not dealing with the people there in Jerusalem. They would have had much more respect for Peter and James and John, who were obviously the three, pillars of the Jerusalem church. They would have not come into a private meeting. They wouldn't have done that, especially being who was in the meeting. Paul speaks about their freedom which we have in Christ Jesus. This is actually the same freedom One of Paul's famous sayings is in 2 Corinthians 3:17, and he was dealing with the Jewish law there. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, or there is liberty. That passage actually deals with the Corinthians and having to do with dealing with the Jewish law as well. The passage gets taken out of its context often, but that's what Paul is saying. If you have the Spirit of God, you don't have to do the law. You have the freedom from the law. These false brothers, he calls them false brothers, and he uses the article. In Greek, it kind of is a distinguishing marker. I've said this before, but when you watch the NFL and the player announcing the players, and you'll have somebody say, "I am from the University of such and such." It's the same way. It's kind of the way they use the article to really point out something. Now, the reason I'm saying all that is it could possibly mean that these false brothers, the Galatians, probably knew who they were. It's probably the agitators that stirred it up in Antioch has now gone up into Galatia, and they're stirring it up there. So these are probably people that they know. And Paul's subtlety in how he writes it is probably telling us that. This idea that they want to enslave us, they wanted to enslave us by demanding that Paul and every other Christian start performing the Jewish law. We'll talk a little bit more about that in his defense of the gospel. But he looks at, if you're going to do the Jewish law, you're back into slavery. And he's really setting up a big section that we will start dealing with in a couple of weeks, but that's what he thinks about the law. But it didn't yield into submission, not even for a moment, or in the Greek, not even for an hour. And why should they? They were not, the agitators were not preaching the correct gospel. They were preaching something in addition to the gospel. In fact, Paul then states a conditional clause so that the truth of the good news may remain with you, or may remain for you, or stay with you for you, which kind of indicates that we had to resist, because the gospel that we preach to you is the true gospel. If we gave in to these people, we're compromising. And we don't want you to compromise, and we want you to make sure that you know we didn't compromise when they came to us and said, y'all need to start doing this. We're not compromising. That's his whole point here. Paul couldn't compromise the gospel. If he did, he would then be preaching a different gospel than what he received. And remember, he got his from who? Jesus. Directly. Paul, I would dare say Paul couldn't afford to preach anything any different. It'd be bad if the Lord came back. Now, Paul, I thought we had this settled on your way to Damascus. What happened? Verses 6, 7, and 8. For those who were held in high esteem, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not show favoritism. They added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they recognized that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. For God, who was at work in Peter as an apostle to the circumcised, was also at work in me as an apostle to the Gentiles. Alright, Paul moves out of his digression. He's back on target here. Okay, back on his topic. He now refers to the Jerusalems by the full expression. In the past it was the ones who seemed to be something. Here it is. They had the short expression before, the ones who seemed. Now it's the ones who seem to be something. And as we talked about, it means people who are in high esteem. Okay. Of course, the question is, again, is he being sarcastic? as we'd already talked about, probably yes and no. Not necessarily to the ones in Jerusalem, but he's being sarcastic to the ones in Galatia. That's the ones that and the agitators are whom he's mad at. Paul is very quick to add his thoughts on these leaders, though, who are thought to be something by others, and he makes a reference that they might be something to others, but God doesn't have favorites. God doesn't show, as the old King James says, their respect for others, and neither does he. The Greek expression is really interesting. He says, "Whatever they were made no difference to me." And it could be translated, "What sort of people they once were make no difference to me." And but what is this idea that God is no respecter of person, of people? It's actually an idiom. It's found in the Old Testament, and it actually means God doesn't accept the face of a human or a man. Is actually the expression that we get. There is no respecter of persons, or God does not show favoritism. And it actually comes from a couple of passages in the Old Testament, predominantly from the Greek rendering of the Old Testament, from Leviticus 19:15 and Deuteronomy 10:17. Here are those passages in Leviticus 19:15. "You will not make unjust judgments in judging. You will not accept the face of the poor, nor marvel at the face of the powerful. You will judge your neighbor in righteousness." So you will not have pity if someone is doing wrong. If you're poor, just because they're poor, you cannot have pity on them if they're breaking the law or breaking the rules. If there's someone in high esteem, you can't. It's interesting. You can't marvel at the face. I like that. You can't marvel at the face of the powerful. You can't judge them any differently than you judge the poor person. So that's one way he gets it. In Deuteronomy 10:17, "For the Lord is your God. He is God of gods and Lord of lords. God, the great and powerful and fearsome, who does not marvel at the face, nor ever accepts a bribe." Those are the passages that Paul is referring to. It's straight out of the Greek Old Testament. He would know them well. Paul's digression is used to communicate a very simple message to his congregation in Galatia. If God showed, and this is another little mini digression, God does not, whatever they were, it doesn't matter to me. God, in no respect to a person, doesn't show favoritism. It's a little digression. But it's here for a very specific reason. If God shows no favoritism, why would you, if you're talking to the Galatians, why would you show favoritism if God doesn't? Why do the agitators show favoritism if God doesn't? Because the agitators were they were trying to preach, the apostles in Jerusalem over Paul. Not Paul, but the ones in Jerusalem. They were showing favoritism. But God does not. Paul makes it very clear that the leaders were fine with what he preached. He didn't ask them, they didn't ask him to preach something different. In fact, the leaders recognized the divine calling in Paul to evangelize the Gentiles, the uncircumcised in the text, just as Peter had the divine call to evangelize the Jews, the circumcised. There's something very interesting that happens in verses 7 and 8. Up until this point, Paul has referred to Peter in his Aramaic name, Cephas. But he switches here to Petros, which is the Greek version where we get Peter from. And as you can imagine, why would he do that? Why is it Cephas, 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 Petros, Petros, Petros? Why? Even scholars are baffled. But here we go. There's probably a few good reasons as to why. Let's see if we can hear some of the possibilities. This was something that was formally spoken while they were there, maybe. And this was the settlement of the matter. We're not going to add anything to Paul and Barnabas, what they're preaching. And it could possibly be that these are not Paul's words, but these were the official words of what came out of the meeting. That is a possibility. So they were using Peter's Greek name, Petros, as opposed to his Aramaic name, Cephas. That's one thing. And it could have been, since Cephas was Peter's official name, while Petros was his personal name, since he's Aramaic, he spoke Aramaic, but everybody would have known him as Peter, Petros. Maybe that was why they changed it. Some have even suggested that verses 7 and 8 are an early interpolation, which means that after the letter was written, or during the time the letter was written, somebody added the words in. I don't believe that. My guess is this was probably the official thing that went down, and these are not necessarily Paul's words. He's reiterating the position of the ones in Jerusalem. Okay, that's, pick one. We don't know why he does it, but he does. I find it interesting. In verse 8, which is a slight digression from the thread of the text, Paul uses the word apostole. Now, we've heard that apostolos means an apostle. Apostole here, though, would be the office of the apostle, the office of the emissary. This is what he refers to. The NIV translated, "I am an apostle to the Gentiles." Peter's an apostle to the Jews. But it was the office of the apostle, which was referred to in the Greek text. Just wanted to bring that out. Regardless, if it was a mission or if it was just the office, God did His effecting work in both Peter and Paul, with whomever they were going to preach to. So that is, everyone in the private meeting acknowledged that part of it. Verse 9, James, Cephas, and John. We're back to Cephas again. Those esteemed as pillars gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Of course, Paul reiterates that who the leaders were that he saw. And this time they strengthened the ones who were regarded to be something. Now they're regarded to be pillars. Probably the spiritual leaders of the church. So this is the absolute full expression, those who are thought of to be pillars now. Last time it was those who were thought to be something. Before that it was those who were thought. So we kind of has his play on words. What's really interesting is now Paul absolutely names the leaders, who he spoke to. These people would have been known by the Galatians. They were Iacobus, James, Cephas, and Ioannes, that's John. This is interesting, but y'all can go look for yourself. This is the only time Paul even mentions John in any of his letters. The only time. Right here. And I've stated this many times, the word order in Greek is always significant. When Paul came to Jerusalem before, he met with Peter, and then he was able to see James. But now, James, Iacobus, is at the beginning. This is probably Paul acknowledging now that James is the leader of Jerusalem. We know in Acts that he became the bishop over the Jerusalem church. Or it could be that Paul is acknowledging that James is the Lord's brother, Or Paul could be reflecting on James' role of replacing Peter as the leader of the Jerusalem church, or he could be singling out James. You already know that I think that he singled out James. And we're going to get to that big time next week. Okay? And we will talk a little bit more about why I think James is specifically being singled out. Now, it is also true that James was the leader of the Jerusalem church. So I want to make that point known. That's probably more of what's going on here. But I still think Paul is singling him out in a bit. Regardless, these three men agreed with Paul. That was the whole purpose of the meeting. And extended their right hand of fellowship to both of them, which was Paul and Barnabas. This was a sign of acceptance in that time. We do that today. Paul and Barnabas were to reach the Gentiles, while the ones in Jerusalem were to reach the Jews. Our last verse here. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I have been eager to do all along. The poor here would have been the poor in Jerusalem. There was a famine going on. If you start reading Paul's letters in chronological order after this, 1st and 2nd Corinthians and then Romans, he starts taking up a collection for Jerusalem. It happens in 1 Corinthians. He talks about it in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4, 2 Corinthians 8, 1 through 9, and then in verse 15 as well. And also in Romans 15, 25 through 28. But Paul had not started that campaign yet. Paul's this use of he was eager to do so, because he was already kind of doing some relief during the famine campaign. They were down there. One of the reasons they were down in Jerusalem was because of that relief fund. He's probably thinking about that now, as he's reflecting on it. Paul wouldn't have seen a request to help the poor in Jerusalem as adding to the gospel. This is something that's very important to. That was not adding to what he was preaching. That was basically showing his compassion. From what we see in the letters, he is not ashamed at all to ask the Corinthians and even the Romans to take up a collection for the ones who were in Jerusalem. And what was probably really going on is that Jerusalem church was being so heavily persecuted by their own countrymen that they probably couldn't get jobs. They probably couldn't buy or sell in the marketplaces. And we get a little bit of that from our Thessalonian study over the summer, that he talks about the churches in Judea. They were just like Jesus because they were, or the Thessalonians were just like the churches in Judea because their fellow countrymen were persecuting them. And he makes out that in 1 Thessalonians. In fact, by collecting the things, it's a common Paul theme, he was putting others' interests above his own. And what better way to act this out in collecting, or by collecting some money for the Jerusalem congregation. The conclusion, Paul makes clear that what he preached was not influenced by the leaders in Jerusalem. It's the main point that he makes, as his opponents probably suggested to the Galatians. The people in Jerusalem were the ones that gave Paul his message, and they told him what he needed to do. But Paul is ignoring that. No, that's not what happened. In fact, he and the Jerusalem leaders were in full agreement on the good news that was to be preached by all of them. And here's the deal. In 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 11, Paul puts forth what he and the other apostles preached. And it's in a general way, but this is what he and everybody else preached. And I've read this many times in English and in Greek. And I'm just going to read it, and then we're going to wrap up with this. Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain. For what I received, I passed to you. Who did he receive it from? Jesus. I passed to you as of first importance. In Greek, it's the first things. The most important things. And here it is. Y'all ready? The gospel. That Jesus died for our sins according to Scriptures. That He was buried, that He was raised on the third day according to Scriptures. And that He appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, He appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then He appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And last of all, He appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. Paul's talking about himself. For I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am. And His grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, talking about the apostles before Him. Yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. And here's the wrap up. Whether then it is I or they, it is either me as an apostle or them as apostles. This is what we preach, what he just stated. And this is what you believed, talking to the Corinthians. And I will make this note. The Jewish law was not in that gospel. We didn't even talk about it.
Right.
Y'all have any questions? It was a little long tonight.